master has placed you in a dreadfully precarious position.
Dungeon Master and Dwarven Sword Master, Hobgoblins, Dwarves, Elves, and Halflings are some of the characters and terms used in this very complicated and controversial game.
You're playing the most phenomenal game ever created.
All right, what's up, everyone? Welcome. It's been a while. We didn't stream last week. I was just like busy and tired, and my kid was home a lot last week. So I just had like no energy and no time to stream. But we're back this week, and we got Greg from Chronicles Virus, who's here quite often. Thanks for coming on, Greg.
Hello.
And we got Vic, as always. Thanks, Vic.
Yeah, you're welcome. And howdy, everyone.
And I thought, well, Greg thought that this week he suggested the idea of talking about the mythical overworld. We've talked in the past about the mythical underworld. It caused a whole sort of RPG game controversy debate, and I'm not feeling too great this week. I feel like I'm getting sick, so if I cough and I'm low energy today, apologies to you guys and everyone in the chat as well. But I'm too tired to debate this stuff. But I do think it's an interesting topic, and we talked about the mythical underworld. What about applying myths to overland travel, wilderness adventures, these sorts of things? I think it's a good topic to talk about. So, thanks for bringing it up, Greg.
I'm looking forward to pissing off everyone again. I think that's what the hobby really needs: people's opinions be met with extreme vitriol.
Yep. Well, we'll say something like, like we did with the Mythic Underworld, like, it doesn't always have to be a mythical underworld. Just we explicitly said there can be like goblin warrens and lairs, and there could be a cave with bears in it. That's fine, as an example. But then you can also have this mythical underworld aspect, and people immediately, because they're illiterate and don't really know what they're doing, just immediately assume that we mean every dungeon, every hole in the ground needs to be mythic. And yeah, that's not what we're saying, and that's not, I don't think, what we're going to be saying this episode, this conversation. But
I'm saying that.
Greg's going to say it. So
on the same token, people seem to think that if it's mythic, it's gonzo, it's clone shoes, it's just also random. I was like, no.
I'm hoping as we get into it, I have some ideas in my head that I think there's subtle ways of doing it. I think there's ways of, it doesn't even have to be a combat encounter, but you can sort of play up, mythical aspects and ideas just by describing a place or a scene during wilderness travel or anything like that. But yeah, I don't know where to start with this, Greg. Since it was your topic, what do you think is a good place to start with this idea? Like source materials, rules themselves, and how they seem to apply them.
I definitely think we should define what we're talking about here. So with the Mythic Underworld, which was distinct from a lair, and we were very explicit about that. We still ran into people who were, even though we explained it thoroughly, but still, the Mythic Underworld is more encapsulated. It's more of its own self-contained concept. There's the dungeon, and the dungeon is the mythical underworld in D&D, and we see that in Underworld and Wilderness Encounters and a few other sources in OD&D. And that concept is carried on throughout the history of the early game, I think. What is that? So why is it mythical? Why is it an underworld or an overworld? In my opinion, that would be... Now, there are some people out there, well, it must have... Only I can talk about this because it's about gods, and it's like about Perseus going to the underworld. I'm like, well, yes, but really the mythical concept comes into play because when you're an adventurer or a person, man, human, stepping outside of the bubble of your day-to-day world and entering a place and encountering things that humans are not really necessarily supposed to encounter on a day-to-day basis. And that's
Sure.
where the mythical part comes in. And it's not as explicit for a mythical overworld as the underworld is, but it's a running theme throughout the entire game, starting with OD&D. And again, referencing book 3 of Underworld and Wilderness Adventures, where it goes into good detail about describing how to do wilderness exploration, create maps and hexes, and generating random wilderness encounters. And that's where we get into people say, oh, it's just gonzo because you're using random charts. I mean, you use random charts in the wilderness, but it's very specific on page 15 of that book, where it describes encounters with mythical creatures and powerful beings that happen in the wilderness. And that kind of reinforces this idea that the world outside civilization, the place that you go to take part in these adventures, is unpredictable and perilous, and the rules are not necessarily the same rules that you would encounter in your medieval village that you just came from. It's an unknown and unexplored wilderness, and that's not just for Dungeons and Dragons. That theme is throughout all human myth, fairy stories, oral traditions. There's a constant running theme in Europe of the enchanted forest or the cursed forest, a dark forest. That would be a good example of the mythic overworld. So that, I think, is a good foundation for the definition that I'd like to propose here for what we're talking about.
No, I fully agree. Especially since I'm European and I grew up on all those myths, and I still use them in my own stuff, like the Black Forest and stuff. Like, the Black Forest is always full of witches and werewolves. Like, that's just a fact. So
Yeah.
Yeah, I agree with that definition. When you were talking, it made me think of because I've been reading a lot of Tolkien lately to my daughter. So my daughter's 4, and we've read The Hobbit, and we're about halfway through the Fellowship of the Ring now. I was surprised she wanted to read the Fellowship of the Ring with me. We read The Hobbit, and my daughter's 4, and she loved it. And Lord of the Rings is a bit more substantial literature food, compared to The Hobbit as far as style and pace and everything. But she's like, no, I want to know what happens to Frodo's nephew, Frodo, and because I told her there's another book after this. Anyways, we've gotten past the part. We're halfway through it, so they're about to make it to Rivendell at the halfway point of the book. And but prior to that, it got me thinking about how when Sam is leaving the Shire, he's never been. You kind of see it in the movie too. They have a scene about it, but in the book, there's just a description, I believe, of him just kind of being in wonderment and kind of confusion as he goes beyond the bounds of where he's ever been before in the Shire.
Mm-hmm.
And he's still in the Shire, but like for him, even parts of the Shire are sort of like mythical because he's not ever been there before. It's a whole new place. He doesn't know the land as well as he did before when they were hiking through it, So it got me thinking about that. And then, just in when they get into the Old Forest and they get into Bree, and even Bree is a civilized place, but it's so alien and foreign to them. And it's, I think there's maybe something we could discuss there is like when you get into outside of your home, as far as exploration in the game is concerned, you do kind of have that free ride too as a GM to start making, I think, strange, even settlements, strange quote unquote safe havens where the players feel out of place and not necessarily safe as well. But that's just where my mind went as you gave that definition. Yeah. And I would say, like, thinking of the Sam example, a lot of it is like of what the mythical like wilderness or overworld is about. Makes me think that much of it is within our minds as well. Like our minds are sort of like because we're unfamiliar with it, I think that within ourselves immediately creates this sense of, well, I don't know this place and I don't know the rules of this place, so anything is possible here, and that's terrifying from a human perspective, I think, because your mind starts to wander, and maybe obviously that's where deep in the dark forest there's like a coven of witches that will catch you and eat you or something like that, or put curses on you. So my mind instantly went to some places like that.
And that's, of course, you mentioned, Sam, it's encapsulated perfectly in the iconic moment, even in the movie, where everything stops and Sam stops and says, I just realized if we take one more step, we're the furthest away from home we've ever been.
Yeah.
And that kind of relates to the Mythic Overworld concept. He's not saying that out of a sense of, wow, this is going to be so much fun. He's like scared shitless, basically. Like they're about to enter a place totally unfamiliar to them. And they themselves are fairy folk. Like the hobbits are mythical creatures in and of themselves. They don't consider themselves that way.
Yeah.
Yeah.
They definitely know that they're different and from the tall folk, like human beings, like in Bree. And so, just to have that realization of you're going into a different world, almost a different world. And in Europe, medieval times and before, it certainly would have seemed that way. And go ahead, Vic.
I always had the sense that Tolkien purposely made the hobbits very mundane and folksy, and they're almost anachronistic. Like they're almost like more 18th century or like maybe 17th century rather than early medieval or whatever. They have like all this stuff that just always felt really anachronistic to me. And then as they venture out of their comfortable lives, like all of a sudden, there's like barrows with undead in it. There's trolls, there's orcs. There's the riders of Rohan who are like, very like I said, Arthurian almost. So just I always felt like Tolkien did that very purposely to just kind of like, it's like, hey, we're starting in this very like pleasant, mundane. It's rural Britain, and then all of a sudden you're just like thrust into this crazy like fantasy world.
Yeah.
And of course, in The Hobbit, the dwarves venture into the actual mythic underworld, which is Moria. Talked about that thoroughly last time.
Mm-hmm.
But if we want to talk about the mythic overworld in The Hobbit, it runs throughout the entire thing. They encounter trolls out there in the wilderness, and they find magical treasure, like in the troll's cave, that has a long and storied history and connection to mythology that not even the dwarves know about.
Mm-hmm.
And Gandalf has to explain it to them, and that is straight in Dungeons and Dragons. Like that happens. If you look in the AD&D Dungeon Master's Guide, Gary Gygax, when he's talking about wilderness adventures, using encounter tables and things like that, he encourages the world building to populate the setting and the adventure with mysteries and ruins and lost civilizations, and use encounter tables and tricks of navigation to make the wilderness seem as interesting and challenging as a dungeon.
Yep.
He wants you to do that. And so I feel like the thought of, he may not be explicitly saying this is the mythic overworld, but the thought of what that means and what that entails within the game is a running theme throughout the entire AD&D first edition DMG and a lot of the monster manual and stuff like that too.
Mm. I want to get to this super chat here. Thank you, Mercurius, for the $5 Australian. He says, there is no mythic underworld or overworld. There's only the otherworld, which you can enter through caves or fairy rings or old forest or etc. I think we'll kind of get to this to a point. I don't really disagree with this. I just think as far as from a game perspective, differentiating between going into an underground place that is the underworld and encountering something strange in ruins or an abandoned mansion or an abandoned keep in the wilderness is another thing, but they may very well be connected to each other as well, And I think we'll probably get into that in our discussion here as well,
Yeah.
because I think this is very much linked. This idea of like the otherworld, or this mystical place of the Fey realm, where the fairies and elves come from, or dwarves, in ancient mythology, or demons or things like that. Like this is something like you can encounter these things in the middle of the day in the wilderness, right? Like if you look at ancient myth, it's not everything is done in an underground setting,
No.
right? And even D&D has that sort of that possibility of weird stuff being encountered even in the overworld, aside from just like armies of orcs and things like that. But
that made me think of expanding the definition just a little bit, because it's not a it doesn't boil down to a dichotomy between this is under the ground and this is above the ground. I think there's more nuance there. The mythical underworld, like Moria, is completely an alien place to you and I, and to adventurers and other folks. You go down there and you encounter things that you would never ever encounter in your normal life, and it's extremely like a totally different universe with its own rules and timekeeping. And we talked about traveling through Moria and how it could take days and days and days, but it actually hasn't been that long. Like the laws of the reality of the outside world don't work there. Now compare that with the mythic overworld, which is populated by strange creatures, magic, myths, ruins, and temples, and abandoned keeps. And most keeps are abandoned, by the way. Mysteries and things like that. There's an element of familiarity there that's absent from the mythic underworld, and I think that familiarity is what helps define the mythic overworld. Yes, you might encounter a mansion that is now abandoned and belonged to some noblemen in a different time. Sure, you can encounter that. Victor can probably walk down the road and see that because he lives in the Netherlands. But in the mythic overworld, that's when you run into the ghosts. You run into these encounters with strange creatures and phenomenon and things. So there's a level of familiarity there, but it's also a level of like monstrosity and otherworldliness that you experience.
I get what you're saying. It blends the mundane with the strange a bit more. Like there's the line is a bit more blurry. It's like like Mirkwood. It's like people in in Middle Earth they used to forests, but Mirkwood, that's not like a regular forest. But so.
Or even the old forest. And so again, I was reading The Fellowship of the Ring to my daughter. You have this forest where, as Tolkien is describing it, the trees sort of move, they kind of direct you where they want you to go. And they seem to talk to each other, and they'll even swallow you whole and put you to sleep and swallow you whole if you're not careful. So I totally see that. I think but that is that sort of, the mythical underworld is like a terrible sort of, it can be a terrible, almost unfamiliar place, right? Where this is like the raw power of the otherworld is here on full effect for you. Whereas I would say most encounters with the mythical overworld, with myth in the wilderness, is like it's bleeding through and it's mixing, like you said, it's mixing with the mundane. I think of I like the Dying Earth stories, by Jack Vance. I've been reading those a bit myself, and there's a lot of that too. And I love Jack Vance's world of the Dying Earth in that, like, there's lots of ruins everywhere of these old Earth cities. There's these abandoned, there's these weird cities too. Where I always think of I think it's Eyes of the Overworld or whatever, where they think that they're living in complete opulence and everybody's attractive and beautiful, but they have these special eyes in their head and they're all just like fat and disgusting and living in huts. And Kujel's like, this is odd. I think he takes like one eye. So he has like one eye in his eye, and then he has his normal eye in the other eye. And so he kind of like goes back and forth, opening his eyes between these worlds, and when he sees like one way, you know, oh, everything's beautiful and everyone's hot, and then he looks the other eye and he's like, oh, actually they're fat and they're that's not a beautiful woman, that's a fat gross lady like sitting in mud inside of a mud hut, you know. And then he goes back to the other eye and it's like she's beautiful and she's in a mansion, and it's like there's multiple stories to it. But when you're reading that, you're sort of, I think this is another aspect that makes it interesting, is that Kujal kind of starts to almost accept the eye that makes everything wonderful. You know, it kind of covers up the mud huts and the fat people and stuff like that. He kind of starts to almost believe it, or he wants to believe it. And you can kind of see, I think, how people with both of those eyes that are living in that world would just totally forget that they're not living in mud huts eating like basic horrible peasant food, because their eyes see it as something else, you know. And so I think there's that breaking of reality in the mythical underworld, and I think that there's sort of that breaking of reality when you encounter these spaces in the overworld, in the wilderness, where strange stuff can happen. And you know, Eyes of the Overworld are from the Dying Earth saga just came to my mind thinking of that.
Yeah. Shane Winter says, what is the link between the mythic overworld and the mythic past? Well, if you're in Europe, it's not the mythic past, it's just the past, right? Victor looks outside and there's like a dragon. Like he gets up in the morning and there's like a castle that was like abandoned in like medieval time.
Yeah, I live in the world of Bright, it's true.
But like the idea behind it in the game term, I think it would be maybe like an exaggerated characterization of myths that and things that people actually used to encounter. When you were in the 800, 900 AD type of period of time, there was no environmentalism then. When you went into a dark forest and you encountered some wolves, you weren't thinking that they were cute, snuggly doggos that needed to be protected. Like these were monstrous creatures. Like they weren't, some people didn't think of them as animals. They thought of them as monsters. And there were weird things that you might never have seen before deep in the woods, like birds and other animals that would sound like they were talking to you. Yeah. Like ravens can mimic human speech, and you don't know as a guy in the 800s why a raven is mimicking human speech. You just know that a bird just talked to you. You're like, holy shit. And so there's like some myths that you might start telling very like campfire tales to your kids about what happened to you in the dark forest. And so those types of encounters were real, actual things that became mythology. And that's where we get the mythic past from. But in the D&D realm of things, using random charts of wilderness encounters that are curated to introduce these kind of like encounters to your players helps bring the mythic past alive at the table, in my opinion.
I think an important part of this, though, especially when it comes to D&D and stuff, is that the setting has to be sort of post-apocalyptic. The current civilization needs to be on top of the ruins, if not multiple ruins of like different civilizations. And that's where the mystery comes from. Like, you know, like you shouldn't be able to know exactly what happened like 10,000 years ago. Like, you don't know. You're just like, you know, the latest cycle of like, you know, this rise and downfall of like, you know, all these civilizations. And you're just like the latest cycle. And, you know, there's no writing from those eras except for like, you know, stuff that like, you know, glyphs on the wall that you can barely read and stuff like that. So you need that sense of mystery as far as like the past and like all that stuff goes. Like you mentioned earlier in Lord of the Rings, like for the most part, Gandalf is the one that like knows all these like myths. Like no other character knows, but Gandalf will just point at some rooms and it's like, oh, those are the ruins of Tragadoon. You know, like I remember when Bloggarth the Relentless, you know, and everyone's like, okay, whatever, Gandalf. Like, so.
Aragorn knows some things too, though. Yeah, you know, in reading it though, it's interesting. Even like as they're going through the Barrow Downs, or they're going past Weathertop, or even Weathertop itself, you know, was once this giant watchtower. And now it's just like this crumbling. It's described as just like this jaggedy crown on top of a hill, you know, because it's all crumbled and fallen apart. And I agree with your take that it has to be somewhat post-apocalyptic, right? Things have to be a little bit closed off, and that's going to add to the mystery, I think, of your setting and your game. Because I think of like Traveler, for instance, too, actually, weird enough, because Traveler sort of has this feudal mentality. And if you're reading the 3 LBBs for Traveler, it talks about taking mail, because of the way travel works in that game. You still have to take like snail mail places. That's how people communicate. So it could take you weeks to go from one system to another. And if there's a war that happens here, by the time that mail gets to the next system, it could be 2, 3, 4 weeks, right? And so it by that point, like when the people on another system hear that there was a war that broke out over here, that war could be well advanced, and who knows what's going to happen there. And I think within a fantasy setting too, like that sense of isolation between some people like to use the term points of light, you know, that sense that sense of isolation between these places makes it feel more mysterious, and like I don't know what's going out there. And when you do get any bit of information from these other places, it really matters, you know.
I agree. B3K asks, where does the Mythic Overworld cross over with the wilderness or the frontier? Well, I believe that, you know, when you're talking about the frontier, you're probably talking about like post 16th century, 17th century, when we're actually America is becoming a thing and we're exploring this wilderness. The difference is pretty simple, I think. Once you explore the frontier, it's no longer the frontier. It's been explored, people live there, and you know what's there, and it's not, the mystery is gone. Like you just you're out there kind of forging your own path across the wilderness, and it's kind of like a man versus nature thing rather than a man versus monster like ghost. There's no religious symbolism there. Well, there is some, but it's not quite the same thing. Once the frontier is explored, it's no longer the frontier, whereas the Mythic Overworld is eternal. And there's always the Mythic Overworld, or at least an idea of it. Even today, in the year 2024, year of our Lord, there are people who are afraid to go to certain places, not just in Europe, but think of the Appalachian Trail and the rainforests in North America that are completely pristine and unexplored, and like you can't even hike through them. It's like without a trail, like you're probably gonna die. Like places like that are still seen today as the wilderness, or like a place where you're not supposed to go as a person. Like you don't belong there. We're not saying that you're gonna encounter werewolves, but people have seen things like that, or at least they say they do. And that's how myths persist, you know?
Yeah, you know, I think of like in a modern sense, look at some place like Skinwalker Ranch, right, which has this notorious sort of, you know, there's a show about it now, but it has this notorious reputation of seeing weird things, experiencing weird things, and weird things happening to people. And, you know, this is a place where at this point it's a ranch or a piece of property that has like plumbing and houses and things on it, but weird stuff still happens there. It's like it's like in the frontier, conceivably, like you explore this natural wild place and then you can conquer it. But something that's like a mythic overworld, like you can try and conquer it, but now you're living side by side with weird existential metaphysical sort of spiritual things potentially, or things that are not like the things you see in the everyday, and it doesn't go away, you know. For instance, the idea comes to my mind of that trope of like, oh no, our house was built on an Indian burial ground, right? Like like there's no way of dealing with that in the trope sense of as how that story is usually used, other than you got to just pack up and move. You know, like that's just what's there. And so you either have to like live with that being there, and it's going to be terrible probably, or you just got to pack up and leave, and it's someone else's problem, you know.
Or you just gotta have overwhelming force or whatever and conquer it somehow.
Yeah.
And then
But
once
that,
you conquer it, it becomes mundane.
yeah,
Yeah.
and that's when
Yeah.
it takes more than just
Yeah.
like that takes like more spiritual,
Yeah.
magical powers as far as
Yeah.
all of a sudden you've built like an adventure, right? You've built something there in that
Yeah.
that sort of thing. Spirit says you could build a casino, you could do that too, but
Yeah, I mean, that makes me think of Fallout, Fallout New Vegas type of stuff. But like Fallout is a great example, and also a reason why post-apocalyptic settings are extremely popular to this day, because it's a very modern and realistic interpretation of the mythic overworld. Nuclear war can actually happen. It can render an entire continent as a radioactive wasteland. And God knows what you're going to encounter in that place if you move away from your ramshackle bunker where you've been like hiding out the whole time. Like that's almost the whole game of Fallout is mythic overworld. You go through and you encounter or atomic punk, like all this weird, bizarre stuff that doesn't seem like it makes sense,
Another good example of that, I think, is the Stalker game series.
Oh yeah.
That also blends that mundane with, because you're just like in Ukraine somewhere, and like, oh, there's an old factory. Like, okay, yeah, it's an old factory, but there's strange shit in there that you don't want to like run into.
The road,
Yeah.
extremely realistic and grim, but still has elements of that. Like they'll be going through and there'll be like weird earthquakes that they don't know what the hell is causing them. Or they'll run across like the scavengers who are like cannibals, and they're like off in the mountains, and you're trying to sleep at night and you hear these like drums beating down from the mountains, and it's like the cannibals that are out there like looking for human like sacrifices and stuff. Like it can happen, like, and that's a real thing.
Well, that's why I said that most of the really good examples are like in some way or shape post-apocalyptic.
Yeah.
Because you need that sense of mystery of like people don't really know what happened before. There's only vague rumors and legends, maybe, if you're lucky. And yeah.
The P3K says, is the mythic overworld related to the idea that a city can be a dungeon? I think it can be, but it doesn't have to be. So, like for instance, in the Bible, there's lots of, I think it's in Isaiah or Ezekiel, it's talking about the destruction of Edom, the Edomites. And it talks about how there's these ruins everywhere. And the idea within the ancient mindset, especially in like Greece, Fertile Crescent, sort of Semitic region of the world, was like ruins and places where it's like civilization is safe. And then if that civilization dies and it's now in ruin, like that place could be inhabited by demons and stuff like that. So I think it's Isaiah or Ezekiel. There's just like this passing line where Lilith is like said to be prowling, the demon Lilith is said to be prowling the ruins of the Edomites, and that there's a unicorn as well, which actually when you translate it, it's more like a bull. So it's like this Baal type figure, this Baal type demon that's prowling the ruins of the Edomites, right? And it's these evil spirits have sort of taken the place back over. And so I think the city can have those sorts of things sort of bubbling out from it, I think that could be extremely interesting. In fact, where you have like this gross seedy city, and this goes back to the ancient mindset too of when you sin, right? The ancient mindset of sin, of doing wrong, is like it doesn't just affect me as a person, like in this metaphysical way only. It actually can taint the whole area around me, depending on what I do, right? And I think that we see that in a lot of myths and a lot of ideas where like there was an evil ritual that happened here, or there was a murder that happened here, something evil happened here, and now the space is haunted, right? I think you could easily have that sort of idea there as well, where there's this sort of someone did something here, or something happened here, or there was a ritual that was done here. There was a religion that was practiced here that's no longer practiced for good reason. And the evil of that place, or the strangeness of that place has sort of just infected the area, the space, like kind of like the Indian burial ground idea I gave, where it's like you got to like live with this or find, like Victor said, some way of actually overpowering it somehow, or you got to just leave, because that's the way it is.
One of my favorite tropes is actually like just the ancient city that has just gone through like different conquerors and just like different civilizations all like ruled over this city at one point in time, and it's just like built on top of like layers of ruins and crypts and like catacombs and stuff like that, and there's just like all this layered history there, and like certain neighborhoods you don't want to go to because the people are a bit weird there, and like that might be because of some ancient curse that's like lingering. You don't want to go to this old barracks because, well, the legion that like was in there, they suddenly disappeared like 100 years ago and nobody knows where they went, but there's like strange things afoot in there. So I love that kind of stuff.
Yeah, or the Vikings who explored America and settled and like suddenly disappeared, and they left all these weird clues and nobody knows what happened to them. They probably got ate by cannibals, It's like stuff like that. Yeah.
Well, that wasn't
going back to the biblical source again, the Bible mentions the wilderness many, many, many times as a place that you do not want to go there. Like if people are exiled to the wilderness, entire civilizations are sent to wander in the wilderness, and it's like just seen as a curse, like it's a curse from God to be forced to go into the wilderness just because it's so horrible out there.
Yeah, I was gonna say, Dundermoose says here, Jesus was tempted by Satan in the wilderness. It's seen as a place. It's seen as a place of like, it's wild. Humanity hasn't subjugated it. It's not under his thumb. He doesn't have control out there. There's other things that control those things. So
it's just going back to D&D for a second. The strategic review guy talks about it in there as well. Talking about why exactly it is that adventurers explore dungeons in the wilderness. And maybe back in the old wargaming days, it was not as mythical. You had armies on horseback and competing nations and things like that. But when D&D was at its heyday, exploring that abnormal, strange world filled with dangers not encountered in civilization was almost part of that was the point of the game. And the random encounter tables were designed like all of these books had the tools for you as the DM to put this into the game because it was supposed to be there. So I would treat any type of D&D game without the Mythic Overworld as missing a key component of what made the game so fun and interesting. That's just me, though.
Yeah. Dennis gives a good example here. Think of the premise of the movie The Witch. They are banished to the wilderness. Yeah, that's one of those things where it's like the whole movie, there's just this creep. I like that movie a lot. It's a good movie.
Yeah.
There's this whole like creeping dread of just what's in the woods, and it's this coven of witches, and eventually at the end, the daughter like succumbs to it and joins the witches. So I think that's that idea. I had mentioned in the past, like Basque mythology. I did a zine issue on some of that, or the wilderness. I think it's Acrebelts or something like that. It's like this sort of demonic figure. He lives in caves, but he also lives in the woods, and he has the covens of witches that worship him in these places. And he's like this goat man, sort of like satanic figure within Basque mythology. So like this stuff is prevalent all over the place in this stuff. But I do like the idea of you sort of like stumbling into it, right?
Yeah.
Or in my mind, I think of, again, like Lord of the Rings stuff where they're trying to get to some place and they always get like rerouted and they end up someplace where it's like, oh no, we were trying to avoid this one spot and now we're here. You see that a lot in not just Lord of the Rings, but in a lot of stories where it's like, they were trying to actively avoid a certain location, but through factors outside and powers outside of their control, they end up being funneled into the place they're trying to avoid. So
I think another good example is obviously the Greeks. Like they were like this big, pretty well developed civilization. They considered themselves like the pinnacle of civilization at the time, but they still had like legends and myths and stories and like whatever. It's like, yeah, if you go up that mountain, yeah, that's where the gods are. Like, yeah, the oceans, yeah, you can sail around for 20 years and there's like islands with like giants with one eye, and stuff like that. So like, yeah, so they had that kind of like that weird divide between the mundane and where like worldly and like blah blah blah, and then like the weird mythical stuff.
And one thing that really points to the idea of the overworld being considered mythical is the fact that you weren't supposed to take anything from the overworld, from the wilderness. You weren't supposed to like take something and bring it back. Like to do that, it was almost at least in myth, if doing that was almost always a bad thing. And even in Tolkien, who kind of helped bring back the idea of finding magical treasure, yes, they did find these powerful magic swords and daggers and things like that, but there's also the One Ring to consider, and which Gandalf considers to be cursed. And there are many magical rings in this world, and none of them are to be taken lightly.
Yeah. Well, there's a chance. There's a chance in D&D, like when you're looking at 0E, for example. Let's use the example of magic swords. Let's say you find a magic sword in this, either in a dungeon or in an overworld sort of situation, right? Where you have alignment in D&D, and most magic swords have an alignment, and so there's this risk of like, here's this magic sword, I'm gonna go and grab it and touch it, but if it's of an opposite alignment than me, it's going to hurt me. Like I'm gonna actually take damage. If it's of the same alignment, it might be good. And then even if it's of the same alignment, what if it has an ego? What if this weapon has an ego and it starts to take control of me? There's this element of just, I think in the modern mindset of the game, we sort of view magic items as like it's like a video game, right? Where it's like, oh, I got the +1 sword, like cool, my stats went up. I think that's how a lot of people in the modern mindset of the game sort of view it. But I think in the more old school and therefore more mythical view, it's sort of like, this is very tempting. There's this, let's say again, there's this sword in this middle of this glade. We fought through some dryads or something like that in order to get to it, because we heard this myth of the sword here, and there it is. But do I dare touch it? Do I dare pick it up? Because who knows what's going to happen to me if I pick this thing up and start using it. There's lots of unknowns in that. That's way more interesting than like, cool, the sword that just gives me a mechanical +1 to everything. Like it's going to boost my stats. It's right there. Cool. Pick it up. Thanks. Add it to the backpack. Like that's boring.
And even you could find treasure that might in the game and in mythology that might not have been explicitly cursed, like, but it brought bad luck to you. Like, for example, yes, they did find a dagger in The Hobbit that revealed when goblins were nearby. That's great and all, until you find yourself in the company of a goblin king who now thinks you're the one who murdered some goblins because you own this dagger. So it's like, it's not a curse, but like just having that makes it like, gives you trouble in the long run.
Well,
like you probably should have left it alone.
And just from a social standpoint too, if we were going with the Lord of the Rings idea too, coming back to Hobbiton with a sword strapped on you and walking around with that in the open, like the other hobbits, if you're a hobbit, are going to look at you very strangely, like, what's up with that guy? Like that guy's like, that's why Bilbo was such a weirdo,
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, don't eat the food.
Thanks again, Mercurius. Advice on going to the Otherworld: don't eat the food,
and don't give your real name.
Yeah, you might find yourself asleep for 1,000 years.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Like I am after Burger King double Whopper with cheese.
Well, you reminded me somehow. You mentioned Traveler earlier, John, and how like because of snail mail, like there's like all these weird myths and like legends and like weird histories develop because it takes like weeks or whatever for like news. I was reading a sci-fi series recently that actually does that really well because only the rich and really powerful have like faster than light travel. Everyone else has to do like sublight, so it could take like 25 years to like go to a different system. And then there's also like time dilation and stuff. So you've got characters who like they remember like being born on this world or having visited this world, but meanwhile like while they have only physically aged like 6 months, like 600 years have passed. So then we saw like of this planet like 600 years ago, and like everyone around them who's never heard of that planet, they can only go off of their memories. But meanwhile, that world is actually advanced 600 years. So there's this weird like disconnect between like all these different elements of the universe because of the way the time scale works.
Yeah. Well, oh, go ahead. Basic.
I was going to say, go ahead.
Well, we've talked about, what it is, what it means, where it comes from, and all the pros and cons, how to implement it at the game table. Now, we've talked about Traveler and Atomic Punk and a few other games. But, the Dungeons and Dragons mentions this like 5 million times. So you can't really escape it when you're a DM making any type of D&D game. But I think the hex grid is a pretty good and important tool, because then you can kind of flesh out, and everyone knows this, but just to reiterate for people who don't use hex grid stuff, you can flesh out an entire region, and the players and the characters don't know what is in each hex unless it's explicitly marked out on a map. So they can run into all these mythical encounters. Just by moving into the wrong area, they might encounter something. They might, again, it was considered that a lot of keeps and citadels and strongholds and fortresses were completely abandoned and left in ruin. You might run across something like that.
Or filled with monsters.
Yeah, bump into some skeletons down there of the people who were guarding it in ages past. So hex grid is, and even in Traveler, like you can do a hex grid of a star region. You can do it of a planetary system. There's all kinds of ways to implement this type of mythic overworld concept in almost any game.
And meanwhile, because there's been like 10,000 years of history and like empires rising and falling, that empty keep, that might have been like owned by like 6 different civilizations that each did their own thing with it. Like maybe at one point it was a prison, and then before that it was like a military, encampment, and before that it was like a wizard's keep. So there's like all these like layers of like weird history and like mysteries and stuff that are just like associated with that building. And only the 1,000-year-old wizard like actually knows what maybe happened.
And it's like the idea of, do ancient civilizations, did they have their own ancient civilizations?
Yeah.
And the answer is yes, they did.
Yeah.
I always think of that scene in the Vikings TV show, which is a pretty good show. Not 100% historically accurate, but there's a lot of history in there. When I forget the name of the king, he's like maybe an Anglo-Saxon king that they try to conquer, and he takes the poor Viking guy like hostage and makes him a slave. And the Viking knows how to read Latin, right? Like that's a very rare thing, right? He teaches him how to do it. And so the king takes him into a room and like lifts the sheets off all these things that are like ancient artifacts. And he's like, do you know what these are? These came from a time before. And it's like, you realize they're Roman. Like he's got all these Roman statues and scrolls and weapons and stuff from like, at that time it would have been 1,000 years old. And he's like, we need to bring this civilization back. And like, so that, that was an ancient civilization even to people in the 10th century.
Well, okay, so the time between when the pyramids were built and Cleopatra is longer than between now and Cleopatra. So like for them, like even their own history was like thousands of years old at that point. So
well, you see that in again, to bring it back to the Bible thing, you see that in the Bible too, I was reading something, and it was like, you have the Nephilim, the angels that come down, and there's a whole ritual that isn't involved. We talked about it in the Mythical Underworld episode, I think, and so on and so forth. But it was talking about how when David fights Goliath, for instance, the way Goliath is described with his bronze armor, like that was something to signify sort of this like a pre-flood, like antediluvian era of like this. Only you would only have that armor and be a giant if you were of the giant race or Nephilim, and then also having that armor signified like I have the knowledge, like I know someone, or so I got this armor from someone who has this sort of knowledge from the before times, and that this armor that I have sort of expresses that, because no one else is wearing bronze armor like this, but I am,
Yeah.
And
Tolkien talks about it many times.
Like this is a very ancient idea that even the ancients that we would call, like you guys said, like ancients, they would have, if someone in David's time, King David's time, or someone reading the Bible in an earlier time would read that story with that context and be like, oh, Goliath knows some things, or he's implying things about himself that are very old, and ancient, and also like dangerous and deadly and secret knowledge, so I don't know, there's things like that I think you can play with in your setting as you're running it, because we're talking, I think we're still talking about application and whatnot. I think I think you could apply it in sort of that way too, as you describe things to your play group and everything like that. I also think of I'm just thinking of Tolkien. When you're reading Tolkien, you see a lot of where he'll just like randomly mention, and there were ruins here with like faded runes, and so like that happens really frequently. It's like there's just these old ruins scattered all over the place, and obviously it's kind of, I think Tolkien's kind of hinting at like the ancient Roman ruins that are all over the British countryside and whatnot that kind of do the same thing. But like you could have that you can just have that as you're describing travel, or you don't even have to have like an encounter there. But I think that there's something to the mythical overworld in that respect, because it creates a sense of the world is old, and there's people that came before us upon which our civilization is standing on. And, who were these people? What was their civilization like? We don't know,
A game that does it pretty well, I think, is Wolves of Gold, because isn't that like basically you're exploring like ancient Roman ruins? You're like 10th century people or whatever that are like exploring these old Roman ruins and dealing with the stuff that's in them.
Yeah, I think I know what you're talking about. I've only read that a little bit of Wolves of God.
I have it on my shelf over here. It's a great game. I highly recommend it. It's a Kevin Crawford game, so it's going to be good. So,
and even at Macuahuitl, the Aztecs would have had evidence that there had been people that came before.
They have a whole mythology around previous suns, and there were people under those previous suns that the gods destroyed, or maybe those people weren't all destroyed. I kind of imply that in Macuahuitl. It's not explicit in Aztec mythology, but I talk about how you as a referee have free reign to make those old things like giants from a previous sun, because some of the quote humans, the people from the previous suns the gods made, were giants, right? Or monkey people, or monkeys and things like that. And so it's like some of them were like fish people, like some of the people from previous suns were turned into like fish and crocodiles or things like that. So like you have all this weird stuff, or maybe that stuff is still out there, maybe
little corners of the jungle.
Maybe there's still like a few giants out there, and they don't, these humans now, at least in Macuahuitl, I imply this, like these humans now are the apples of the eyes gods. The gods care about these people, and these older people from older suns are sort of like forgotten, and they're not, the gods don't favor them anymore. What kind of animosity would that breed between, people of that older sun and the people of the current sun within that mythology? So,
and it's like attempts to scientifically explain away these things have always been extremely lame to me.
Yeah.
I think of the one green text post where he's talking about the commonplace thing where it's like, oh, the ancient sailors thought that manatees were mermaids because they had a tail. It's like, okay, so I guess beautiful women luring people to their death wasn't a thing. It had to have been manatees. Like, no, it was like it was an art. Yeah,
Have you seen a manatee? Like,
it was an archetype of like
have you seen 16th century women? I mean, come on.
fear of the ocean and fear of beautiful women was a universal human thing. It wasn't had to scientifically to explain that. No, you don't need to do that.
No.
you know, I have religious beliefs and all that kind of stuff too. So I'm a firm believer that a lot of that stuff is like real. There's something that was experienced and there was something that was seen there, you know, and I think we have our own version of that in the modern sense of like UFOs and things like that. I was reading a book about how modern UFO experiences, if you look at like the stuff that happens in a modern UFO experience from like the last 50 years, and you look at for instance, an occult experience, an experience with the supernatural or with the demonic or with again, like occult ritual and things like that, there's a lot of similarities. Now, I'm not gonna get all Alex Jones and be like, yeah, they're interdimensional lizard, but I want to say that like we can get on our high horse as modern people and talk about how dumb our ancient ancestors were for believing that there were mermaids out there that would lure you and kill you in the sea. And then at the same time, we turn around and go like, did you hear that the Pentagon said UFOs are real? And it's like, we have our own version of it today, guys. We're not smarter. We're not more intelligent than our ancient ancestors. It just manifests in a different way.
Well, I mean, you can laugh at your great grandfather believing that there were witches in the Black Forest or whatever, but I would bet he knew how to survive better in there than I do. Like, if I wander in there, I'll probably die. But my great grandfather, who thought there were witches and gnomes and like all that stuff, he knows that shit like the back of his hand, and he can just like, oh, like this mushroom, yeah, if I eat this, I can survive for a week. It's fine. So,
Mythology of modern people in 1,000 years is going to be so sad. Like, do you guys know that back in ancient times there were people who put on animal costumes and they had orgy rituals? Yeah, they were called furries. It's like, God damn it. It's like the worst.
Here we go. Spoiler: UFOs equal balloons. Sorry to burst your bubble, pun intended.
I was actually watching the UFO stuff earlier. The host was talking about UFOs.
Well, that's like this here. I agree with this. There are scientific hypotheses about the Mesoamericans not being able to visually see Cortez's ships because they had never seen boats before. That's beyond silly caveman nonsense. Well, especially considering that they had war canoes. They had stuff that would float on water, which humans would sit on.
Yeah.
So it's like, I don't know why. I think it comes, and maybe we can touch on this a little bit too. I have no problems taking a dump on the Enlightenment and the post-Enlightenment era, because I think it, for a lot of reasons, it's actually killed a lot of the mysticism and a lot of the enchantment that we used to have as humans. And now everything's like materialistic, which has its own sort of presuppositional problems when you deny the metaphysical. Like, where does logic reside? What are numbers? There's a lot of problems with the presuppositions of the Enlightenment era and the post-Enlightenment era that we just sort of assume these things are true now because we as a civilization are children of that ideology. But I think it just comes from this this desire on our part to just explain everything, and our ancient ancestors, and by extension people in our game worlds that are in such a similar setting, they don't need to have an answer for everything. It's perfectly feasible for them to, like Vic's Black Forest idea, like, don't go in the Black Forest. Well, why? Well, there might be fairies in there, but also it's just, have you seen it? We call it the Black Forest for a reason.
Yeah.
Don't go in there.
Yeah, and that's part of the reason why, and everyone in this chat truly, and most people now think that modern D&D or whatever it's become, and a lot of modern games are so lame and weak and dumb now is because they've become too materialistic. Things like tieflings and goblins and elves and dwarves and halflings used to have mean something and be something and have
Mhm.
mythological connections, and now they're nothing. Like you've taken that, you've ripped that all away
Yeah.
for some reason. I don't, political, whatever. And that just, it ruins it. And that's why you shouldn't do that to the Mythic Overworld. You shouldn't just have your adventuring party go out and get some gold coins and come back, and the dragons are just animals.
Mm.
You should really dive into what Gygax and the other guys were doing, which was tie together like old myths. I mean, deities and demigods. That whole book exists for a reason. They talk about introducing areas in the wilderness where gods and these creatures would interact with human beings and what that was like. And you've got to tie your game to some kind of uh, transcendental value beyond just the materialism of going to find coins, in my opinion, to make it interesting.
That's why I kind of hate like the whole thing. Like, oh well, where do the goblins poop? Like,
Yeah.
like I don't know. They're like weird inhuman monsters that live in this ancient cave. Like, let there be some mystery how they actually live there and survive. You're not gonna live among them. You're not gonna like be like Jane Goodall or whatever that Gorillas in the Mist chick is called. Like, and study them. You're in there to like get some treasures, and they're trying to kill you, and then hopefully you can get out. Let there be some mystery about where they're pooping and how they're sleeping and what how they're breathing and what they're doing. They're just there and they want to kill you and they're weird. So that's all that matters. That's all you need.
I like Spirit's response. Where do they poop? Everywhere.
Yeah,
Just everywhere in the lair. They don't care.
Maybe those caves that you're in, they're actually made out of poop. Who knows?
This sounds like a Lamentations of the Flame Princess module.
Yeah.
And it's not even. Oh, go ahead.
Well, so I had a thought and it just escaped me. Go ahead. I might come back to me while you're talking.
Well, this is semi-related, but I was trying to explain to a guy on the Quorum Gilded. So I run a small Gilded server, very small, where we talk about this type of stuff all the time. And one guy was, I had mentioned that ancient people would laugh at modern day physicists because what modern day like quantum physics is trying to explain, ancient people already knew about like thousands of years ago, and that was part of their day-to-day life. Like, it's like, oh, now we have this concept, scientific idea that everything is interchangeably interconnected and related, and everything like is from a same like source. And it's like, we've got this brilliant idea called string theory. It's like, bro, like thousands of years ago, people knew that was true. Like, it's not that they had this weird belief, that religious belief, like to them, that was the truth. Like, so like if you brought somebody from Greece, ancient Greece, 4,000 years ago, they would just laugh. They would laugh at modern day physicists. It's like, bro, this is our day-to-day life, But anyway, have you thought of your thought?
No, it escaped me. I think I'm too tired to remember it. I have some Biden brain going on, just because. So again, I'm fighting sickness. I think so. Apologies if I'm
down with the sickness.
Yeah, I'm getting down with the sickness. If I'm a little spacey. I don't remember what I was going to say though. I don't remember.
Well, we've been kind of going for over an hour. Do we want to start wrapping it up? If you guys have any extra thoughts on the matter?
Yeah, I mean, I don't want. Usually we go for 2 hours, but again,
Okay.
I'm super low energy. I don't know if I can last that long. But I think that we need to. I think a lot of it is that we're children, like I said, of the Enlightenment and the post-Enlightenment era, where we have to have an explanation of everything, and we can't ever shut our brain off of asking the questions of like how, and just be going like, that's weird, and I don't know how to explain that. And I think partly for me, maybe it's a little bit easier because I've experienced things where it's like I can't explain that, and so I think I have some first-hand experiences of things where I'm just like I don't know what that was. I don't know how to explain that situation or that experience, but that happened. Yeah,
Yeah.
and I can try and explain it, but I don't think that I can. And so I think when you have those sorts of things, because and I'm not saying you have to be like religious, go to church or something. Because Vic over here, he's not religious at all. So it's like, but I think you have to be able, and Vic I think is able to do this. This is why Vic is so good at his ideas and settings and stuff like that. You have to be able to just kind of use your imagination and just kind of go wild with it and the science of something as far as we understand it be damned, right?
Yeah.
Like, who cares?
Yeah,
Well,
it's like
I'm able to put myself in other people's shoes, so I'm able to think like, how would a religious person see the world? Even though I'm personally not religious, like how would a religious person see this like world that I'm like developing? So like I don't
Like-
get hung up on my own like
You're not solipsistic. Like
Yeah.
I think that's maybe what the problem is a lot of people, they only have their singular viewpoint, and so
Yeah.
they can't imagine a pre-enlightenment era where
yeah.
we were villagers living in a village and we were afraid to go into the Black Forest because there's gnomes and goblins and witches in there. We can't just, that just sounds silly to us, and we can't comprehend that someone could be intelligent and yet believe those things at the same time.
Yeah, everyone
Maybe it
thinks
helps.
they're this enlightened, scientific, gilded Redditor now
Yeah.
that can
I don't know. Is
watch
that
this
maybe
Neil
more an
deGrasse
American thing?
Tyson. What's that?
Is that maybe more an American thing because you guys are such a young country? Like, I don't know,
Yeah.
maybe it's because I'm European and I'm like just completely used to the fact that like I live on this continent that has like 5,000 plus years of like history. Like I have like stuff around me that's like 1,000, like 1,500, like 2,000 years old. Like my town, like the name is still based on the original Roman name. So, and that's just like whatever to me. So maybe it's just because of that, like I don't know. I just have a better sense of like history and myth and like whatever. I don't know.
Yeah, it's a different worldview. I think you are onto something, because the Enlightenment and post-Enlightenment era kind of ideas, I mean, they started in Scotland, but they really took off here in America with the founding fathers and the planting of this country. Which this country is also a very Protestant country, which is a very young-ish religion. It's only 500 years old. You just said you have buildings in your hometown that are older than sort of the religious tradition that this country is founded on itself, let alone the country itself.
Yeah,
Like
exactly.
the religious background of this country is younger than like buildings in your hometown. So
yeah, I've lived in houses older than America, so yeah.
There tends to be a stereotype that Americans value personal experience versus Europeans who value credentials, like academic credentials, academic accomplishments. And I don't know if that's true or not, but they both have pros and cons. But you can just, Basic Expert has said he's seen some weird things that can't be explained, and perhaps they shouldn't be explained. Let me tell you the story about the missing car keys. So I was working at a call center, and it's, call center is set up in these rows with guys, and they're like the rows are facing each other. One guy was fucking around with his car keys. It's just tossing them up in the air and then catching them. And they're shooting the shit with some other, like 2 or 3 other guys, and I was there. This is a stupid story, but it just is an example of a mundane thing that you can never explain. And he tosses his keys up in the air, and I'm watching him, and one guy, his eyes are following the keys in the air as if they were in slow motion. Like a slow motion camera was following the keys, and he was watching them, and then they hit the ground, and the keys disappeared. They completely fucking disappeared. I swear to God. Like 4 people witnessed this happen. And like that one guy almost pissed his pants because like we were all watching it. And like, we were moving chairs and moving furniture and like looking. We got out flashlights and like started looking around, like trying to find them. They went through the floor. I swear to this day, we all saw it happen. They went zoop and just went completely disappeared from existence. It was the weirdest shit that I've ever seen. And you know, what science is going to explain that? Maybe they somehow bounced across the room. Nah, man, we looked through those keys for like 3 hours. They're gone. Who knows what happened to them?
They're in the mythic underworld.
Well, yeah,
Yeah.
now imagine like some weird two-worked dinosaur, like some guy with like, you know, he's carrying like a laser rifle, but he's also like got a tooth necklace and he's wearing like Roman armor on his chest, and he like looks up and like keys just fall from the sky, and he's like, oh, keys, so weird, and he just like puts it on his necklace, and it's like
Yeah.
to him, like it's the land of lost things.
I don't think any civilization will ever be completely free from these phenomenon.
Yeah.
Like,
Well, I'll say one of my experiences that I've had, and this might resonate with Victor too, because I think I've talked to Vic about this kind of stuff before. But I used to suffer really badly from sleep paralysis. So when I was like, my wife and I've been married for over 10 years now. It's been 11 years. Maybe in the first 2 or 3 years, like from high school into like the first 2 or 3 years of being married, I experienced sleep paralysis pretty badly. And there was one time when we were married, we were married for maybe 2 or 3 years. I had a sleep paralysis episode or whatever in the night. It's always weird too, because it's like I always see like electricity around the side of my vision as I'm falling asleep. And so like as I'm falling asleep and I see that like electricity in my peripherals, I'm like, oh, it's gonna happen tonight. So that's what happened. And so I had my sleep paralysis, and then it was sort of like I got to a point where I just got to like relax and it'll go away eventually. And so I have my sleep paralysis, kind of lets me go. I turn over, roll over, go back asleep. And then I wake up again and I'm like, oh, I just felt like compelled to get out of bed. I look around our bedroom and my vision is like really misty and cloudy. I'm like, what the heck's going on? I'm like rubbing my eyes. And so I get out of bed and I walk to the foot of the bed, and I'm in our bedroom. At the end of the bed at the time, we had like an armoire where my wife kept a lot of her coats and dresses and things like that. So I like leaned up like my arm like that on the armoire, and I'm like still rubbing my eyes. Everything's like misty and cloudy still. I could see things, but it was like there was just a mist in my vision or in the room. And I turn around and look at my bed, and I see myself in the bed and my wife, and I'm like, what the heck? And then I woke up.
Yeah.
And when I woke up, I was back in my bed. I like sat up in bed, and I was like, that was weird. And like I could come up with any kind of explanation for it was a dream. I know what my bedroom looks like. You could say any of that, but to me, like deep down, that will never be, having experienced it, that will never be like a very satisfying that will never be like a satisfying explanation to me, right? So that's one of those things where I think having experienced those sorts of things, you sort of, and not trying to over rationalize it, because you're kind of understanding where like I could come up with a naturalistic explanation for what happened there, but it could have been any number of things. It hasn't, and these sort of sleep paralysis episodes haven't happened in maybe 7 or so years, 6, 7 years. I haven't had them. Thankfully, they're not fun. No. So, yeah.
Yeah, I used to sleepwalk and like have like horrible night terrors and stuff like that. So I feel,
yeah.
Like that episode of the X-Files in season 1, when the astronaut encounters a weird ghost from Mars, and like the ghost like invades his bedroom while he's sleeping, and it's like real creepy. Do you know what I'm talking about? And
I remember that one. Yeah.
I don't want to go into space. Fuck space.
I've had weird things happen. Like, I've told the story before with the shaking plants. I'm not going to go too much into it because it was a stupid story. But the shaking plants, you probably know, John.
Yeah.
But, like, I've looked for like a scientific explanation. I've literally Googled like, can plants shake? No, they're just plants don't do shit. So like, I still cannot explain that one. So.
And maybe it shouldn't, like Greg said, maybe those things
Yeah.
shouldn't be explained, and that makes
Yeah.
everything a lot more interesting, right? And I think that I don't know. I think that not being open to that stuff. If you okay, I get people being skeptical in the real world. I get it. But when you're creating a game that takes place in a fantasy setting where you explicitly say there was a previous civilization and there was an apocalyptic event, and there's elves and there's dwarves and there's ghosts and there's wraiths and there's witches and there's dragons and there's goblins and there's gnomes, there's wights, there's undead and zombies inside tombs, there's wizards and wizard towers that do magic and occult rituals, there's clerics with holy power, and I'm going to naturally and materialistically explain all of that to you throughout the course of this campaign. It's like, bro, just stop. You just knock it off. You had me until the very end there where you said I'm going to have a materialistic explanation for all of this. Like, go back to Reddit. I don't care.
Yeah, and I made a post on Twitter about magic systems in fantasy and how I thought they were fucking stupid. Because like, oh well, so the witch has an enchanted fire sword. I want to know all the details of how the rules of that sword operate and how the magic functions and how she is able to. It's like, no, it's just a magic fire sword. She got it from like a volcano. Like,
yeah, I'm not a fan of magic systems and like.
Yeah,
I mean, they can be cool, but there needs to be some mystery. It needs to be esoteric and weird.
You don't need to have an explanation for magic.
Make it another version of science, basically.
Yeah.
And people and nowadays, because of again, the basic experts reference to humanism, everyone when you say magic now, everyone thinks of slinging fireballs and lightning bolts in Harry Potter. They don't think of strange symbolic events and mythical encounters like you would see in the mythic overworld that we're talking about. So it's like, it's like a totally different train of thought of the modern day versus heck the past 10,000 years of human existence, and it's a real shame.
I think we experience things, and I think because of the humanist sort of thing, we immediately want to naturally explain it. I think because growing up in such a humanist sort of thing, we fear the unknown, and I think that's why shows like the X-Files and things like that were so popular in the 90s and even to now. Twin Peaks and stuff like that. Why the Twin Peaks: The Return? I think that show did pretty well for how weird and bizarre it was, because it's all about we can't explain this. And these are things that are among us and we can't explain it. It's why people watch Ghost Hunters or that Secrets of Skinwalker Ranch show or something like that, because we crave that kind of stuff. We crave mystery. And so I think your players in a game crave that sort of thing too. That's why they're sitting down to play. You sit and you say, deep in the woods, in the Black Forest, if you can survive through the Coven of Witches and make it past, they have a secret shrine embedded in the mountain to their demon god. And inside there, and if you can get past the undead and the ghosts and the wraiths and things like that, maybe there's treasure in there. It might be cursed treasure, but it's treasure. That's super interesting. That's super interesting, and we crave that sort of thing. And just leaving it at that is way more interesting than trying to materialistically explain every aspect of the step along the way of that. Well, they're not actually witches, and well, actually the way magic works in my system is that they do this. It's pretty much like science. It's the science of the setting, and there's no mysticism to it. Like, you take this great idea that you had, and then you chop it off at the knees and make it lame and stupid.
Yeah.
So
exactly.
But
yeah, it's different from the Mythic Underworld too. So going back to that dichotomy we talked about earlier in the stream, the difference between the two. I think the Overworld is about encountering something more mundane and having it end up being fantastical, whereas the Mythic Underworld is, and that when you go down into the dungeon, you're going to see weird shit.
Yeah.
You don't know that you're going to see that as you're wandering through the wilderness, and that's what offers the mystery and excitement, I think. Like a dream, you know that weird feeling you get on the back of your neck and your hairs stand on end and you get a weird chill when something unexplainable happens or something really weird. Um, to me, the dream would be to have a player experience that at the table to something they encountered in the game.
Hmm.
Very, 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 very difficult to do. But I think Gygax and the other guys, they wanted you to have those type of experiences just by playing the game.
Yeah, I think so. At least have the opportunity to try and have that
Yeah.
happen. Get as close as you can. I mean, it's all going to depend on immersion and all that kind of stuff. Yeah, B Dubs is. We talked about Jack Vance. B Dubs. I mentioned the Dying Earth stories and stuff like that, and Eyes of the Overworld and all that kind of stuff. So definitely Jack Vance. His Dying Earth stories are fantastic for seeing like ancient civilizations and a overworld that's full of weird, strange stuff that doesn't make any sense. I love I love the story that I'm reading right now from the Dying Earth, where Kujel he encounters this like ghost in some ruins, and the ghost is like, you have to destroy this structure that he's haunting in order to free me, and if you don't, you're cursed. And so then he's like, okay, I guess I'll do it because I don't really have a choice. But then he changes his mind and he runs away, and the ghost is like, you're cursed, essentially. And so Kujel's running away, and he's like, I gotta like figure out how to do this. So the one curse was like, it said one thing, and then he meets these like little fairies, and the fairies like play a trick on him, and so then he like kills one of the fairies, and then the fairy dying breath, it curses him, but the curse is like sort of the opposite of the first curse he got, and he's like, oh well, I'm good because now the curses cancel out because these can't both be true. And then he gets to like another guy and he gets like another curse, and it's like contradictory, and he's just like constantly thinking about his day and how he's been cursed by this specter and now this fairy and then this guy, and it's like and just all of this is encountered within like the same area within a matter of days within the story, and it just made me think of it's all done kind of humorously, but I was just struck by like thinking about that in the mythical overworld, about how that's the kind of stuff that could happen in your game. And Kujel doesn't sit and think like, oh well, he's cursing me, it must mean that within quantum string theory, blah blah blah. He's just like, I got cursed, and then this other curse happened, and it's like this other curse is like the opposite of the first curse I got, so these both can't be true, so I must be good, like this super basic logic where it's good enough for him. And so I don't know, I think that there's something innocent and interesting about that sort of mentality, and trying to recapture that in your game is fun and interesting, and it makes the game more interesting.
I mean, the best pulp writers were experts at that. I think of H.P. Lovecraft especially, because the characters in his stories were often not adventurers in any way, shape, or form. They were just either regular people, or at best they were scientists or academics or detectives, something like that.
Yeah.
And imagine going to a place like Innsmouth, where it seems like on the outset that it's a normal town and everything is fine, and then strange things begin to occur, and it's just nobody sits there and reads stories about Innsmouth and it's like, oh, it's so unlikely that there would ever be fish people, because of evolutionary principles. No, it's like you sit there and you get creeped the fuck out about it, like, and that's the whole point behind the mythic overworld type of encounters, is to be creeped out and to encounter interesting things, and not be like, well, actually dragons breathe fire because they have hydrogen gas in it's like, dude, no, go away.
Yeah, it's just like, go back to Reddit, come on. Mercurius says in Celtic legend you don't want guys that contradict each other. Yeah, but Kujel in the stories, he's not as smart or as witty or as clever as he himself thinks he is in the stories, and that's partly what makes it charming to read. Is you're reading it, and you're like, man, if I was in his shoes, like I'd be a lot more concerned about this than he is. But hey, he seems like he's fine. So
Kind of reminds me of Through the Looking Glass when Alice eats the mushroom that makes her really big, and then to counteract that, she eats one that makes her really small, and it makes her really small. So to counteract that, you have to eat one that makes her big, and it's like this. It's like she's fucking up. Like she's like constantly trying different things to try and fix it, and it's only making it worse.
I think B-Dubs has a good point here too. Mythic Overworld requires better players too. Current Brosar discussion is about improving players. I'm assuming not just DMs. It's true. Like if your players are not interested, if they're not into it, if they're not willing to engage with these things, or they're just being silly about it and they can't do it, then you're going to have a problem running this sort of thing. I think it's a twofold problem. It's GMs that want to be over materialistic in their fantasy games that shouldn't be materialistic and should have like this supernatural metaphysical element over the top of them. And then players that are unwilling to do it as well. So
I don't really want anything to explain too much, though. It's like even just mundane stuff, like let's say I have like the Soviet Union in like one of my games. Like I'm not gonna tell you its history. I'm not gonna tell you about the October Revolution and stuff like that. It's just the Soviet Union. It exists. You know that it's over there in Russia, and your character might consider it evil, and like that's all you need to know. So.
Yeah, I think that's part of it too. Is we want to just over-explain everything, and part of the mythicalness of it is that myths explain. When you read them, it's like up until the Enlightenment era, that explanation was enough for you to go like, oh, okay, I can go on with the rest of my life. And I think this myth adequately explains what I, as a mortal, need to know in order to deal with this sort of situation when it arises. Right? Is to do X, Y, Z as the myth states, and there's like practical elements to it. Like, we're going to go back to the Black Forest here. Don't go in the Black Forest because there's witches and there's gnomes and there's elves in there. They might trick you and they might lead you astray. Well, maybe there's witches and elves in there. Maybe you'll just get lost. But at the end of the day, that myth saved you from going into the forest and probably dying.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So,
and we picked a lot on Redditors, and they're certainly pick-worthyable. But I wanted to add that you can still be quite a reasonable, well-educated, and scientifically versed person and get a lot out of things like myths and legends in the Mythic Overworld. That just means you have a well-rounded and well-versed logical worldview, something that we've completely forgotten. Like as a Western civilization, as society in general, we've forgotten about. It's not about only scientific inquiry. Thanks Enlightenment. Like where's the symbolism? Where's the ancient values? All this stuff forms part of who you are as a well-rounded guy. And maybe that's an old school mindset, and by old school I don't mean OSR. I just mean like not even pre-modern, but someone who's got their head on their shoulders. I think the basic expert is insinuating that as well, talking about the Enlightenment and humanism and the disastrous effects they've had.
Well, I don't want to I'm not a philosophy channel, but like I just think that a lot of it is built on false or faulty, or just a lot of it just begs the question as the logical fallacy. It begs the question. It assumes that a premise is true and builds everything on top of that to a conclusion, and we just sort of take it for granted because it appears to work most of the time, but it doesn't always work. Again, like I've experienced things where it's like, that doesn't always explain this situation that I just occurred in my life, or this story that I heard, or I really trust this person and they told me what they experienced, and I can't this Enlightenment era explanation for everything mindset doesn't explain that situation in an adequate way. Like, even if we try, it's sort of like maybe.
Yeah, that's kind of where I was going earlier when I referenced the idea of Americans being more experiential and Europeans valuing credentials. Because, like, you might have an experience of a phenomenon and you explain it to some Frenchman. And he's like, but sir, you are not a doctor of the arts. You wouldn't have no clue. Like, it's like, that type of thing.
Maybe, I don't know.
Vic's European, he would know.
Yeah. I don't know. I don't really trust anyone.
He does.
I don't really give a shit about your credentials either way. So
screw your credentials and your experience. I don't trust you.
Basically.
But
trust in only one thing, and that is Doge.
Yes.
I must.
What I think my problem is with the Enlightenment mindset, if we're going to go down that road just a minute, is that you have to be almost be like David Hume to be consistent and just be skeptical of everything, and that you can't know anything for certain. You can't derive oughts from ises, and you just have massive problems if you're going to be skeptical of the metaphysics of things. It just doesn't work. So that's just my personal view. But I might crash in here right now. Vic's probably crashing even more because I know it's later for you. I think we've kind of touched on everything here within this topic, but I think that we just need to be willing and just to practice the exercise of explaining a little bit less in general in our games, and just letting the player's imagination sort of fill in the gaps via mythical interpretation of things. So I think we as humans are naturally built to do that. And I think if we do that at our tables, it's really easy to do that. And you start building a very mythical and fantastical setting in your game world when you allow that to happen. And it's very tedious. It's very hard to not want to just explain everything away in even your setting. But I would encourage people to avoid doing that. I don't know if you have any final thoughts.
And have a healthy knowledge and reading of the old books and understanding what people like Gary Gygax meant when they were talking about all these things. They weren't just shitting it out for no reason. Like, there was a reason why the game was made this way.
Just have fun and enjoy the mystery and enjoy the, I don't know, like, you don't need to know where the goblins poop. Like, maybe you don't even have buttholes at all. Like, who knows? But they're just down there and they want to kill you, and you're trying to get their gold. That's all you need to know. And then just have fun. Like, I don't know.
Yeah. All right. Is there anything you guys want to plug before we close this episode out?
Yeah,
Greg,
man,
I know you got your Kickstarter ending soon. 4 days, right?
Yeah, probably less than 4 days now, but it's going to say 4 days. Dunder Moose has already plugged it quite a bit, and that is not a Mythic Overworld game, although it can have concepts of it in it as you explore the blasted wasteland of the world, trying to hunt down and fight kaiju and mutants and things. So check out Titans of Fallen Earth. If you Google it, it'll pop up everywhere.
It's in the video description below. So if people click on the video description, I have a link to it there.
And anyone complaining that I haven't explained how the game works can blow me, because I've been on 9 streams now. I've literally been on 9 streams, like more than fucking Alexander McCrease. So you can find me out there. I'm on Basic Expert. I've been on Dunder Moose. It's crazy what I've done.
How about you, Vic?
Just the usual. Check out Modern Necessities. I'm still waiting on the proofs for the physical copies. It should be coming. Like, I got text messages today that it was supposed to arrive, and they didn't. So I don't know, maybe tomorrow. But yeah, once I get those and they look okay, I'll go to Drive to RPG and make them active, and I'll send all the backers their codes. and that step of the process will finally be done.
Nice.
And then I'll probably start shilling it more because I've been kind of waiting for to actually get to the physical copies too, because I know a lot of people, they don't want to just buy PDFs and stuff, so it's like, I don't know, shilling now seems like wasted effort, so I've been kind of waiting. But once that's done, maybe I'll start jumping onto some streams too. I already kind of poked at Black Lodge to see if they maybe will have me on again. So yeah, if you like modern stuff, and you can combine it with the mythical overworld. I mean,
There you go.
People mentioned Annihilation, great movie. You could easily run something like that with modern necessities. So, or maybe you're a special forces team and you have a mission in the Black Forest and you step in there and all of a sudden there's witches. Who knows? Like,
or you got to take out the Giant of Kandahar.
Yeah, like stuff like that. So yeah, all sorts of things you can do. So yeah, check it out.
I have a link to Modern Necessities in the video description, but down below too. So if people are interested in checking that out, it's in the video description below. I also have, from me, I got Atomic Pumpkin. Yay! Except it's kind of hard to see here, but you can see how there's this weird box kind of faintly around it.
Yeah.
Every single image that is transparent has this problem, and I think it's because I screwed up the color profile for the book. So it looks good. As you can see, the book looks great otherwise, except for that weird minor problem. But it printed great from Lulu.
Yeah.
But I just got to fix that problem because I don't want people to buy the book and then I'm a perfectionist. So you can faintly see that square there. It just annoys me. But hard copies are coming soon. I'm waiting on, hopefully the drive-through RPG proof should be coming in at some point within the next few weeks. Hopefully it'll look better than this. I had to re-upload and order a new proof from Lulu for this one. So I'm working on it. I'm trying to get it going. So Atomic Punk 2240. It's kind of like the updated version of 2160, more streamlined. People are asking, like, what's in this one that's not in 2160? And it's like, well, the game makes a lot more sense. It's a lot more streamlined, better art, better layout. There's a setting in here as well. It's the Treasure Valley where I live here in Idaho. So, if you want a quick setting, I think it's just overall a more streamlined, better game. So make sure you check that out. Also, Macuahuitl. I have a link to that in the video description below, both to Atomic Punk PDF and Macuahuitl. If you want the hardcover, the fancy hardcover, I am selling those on my Gumroad web store. I can ship them to you. I have about 168 or so, 165 left that I can sell. And so if you're interested in that, the link is below. You can go ahead and purchase it if you missed the Kickstarter. So make sure you check that out. Check out these other guys' stuff too. Vic hasn't streamed in a while, but I think we've talked about someday getting that back up.
Yeah,
you're busy though, so
yeah, maybe next year we'll see. I don't know. I've also just kind of taken a step away from the hobby a little bit because of all the drama, and I don't know.
I get it.
Yeah.
I'm kind of like I've really felt like over the last few months, it's like I need to refocus and work on my channel a little bit and on the books that I'm writing and working on and the zine and all these things, making it so people want to support the channel via subscription, with the supporters and stuff like that. So
yeah,
I think I put too much on my plate, and some of the things on my plate don't matter as much as other things. So I'm trying to reevaluate things. So I always do that to myself. But we'll end it here. Thank you everyone for watching. Thank you, Mercurius, for the chats as well, the super chats, and everyone else for supporting, watching, liking, subscribing. We will we'll catch you guys in the next video. Check out this guy's stuff. Links are in the video description below. And we'll catch you guys in the next stream.
Yep. Thanks for the discussion, y'all.
Dag iedereen.
Later.